In the autumn of 1964, when American rockets were already thundering into the sky and the first images of Earth from orbit were being beamed into living rooms, a young East German border sergeant named Egon Schultz walked into a dark Berlin courtyard carrying a Soviet-made machine gun and the full weight of his government's expectations on his shoulders. He did not know that beneath his boots, buried 12 meters down, a hand-dug tunnel was carrying dozens of his fellow citizens out of the country he had sworn to protect. He did not know that in a matter of seconds, he would be dying on the damp cobblestones of Strelitzer Strasse 55, a victim not of enemy fire alone, but of the very system that had put him there. For a generation of East Germans, the name Sergeant Egon Schultz would be taught as a story of Western aggression, a brave border guard murdered by West Berlin agents while defending the Berlin Wall. His face hung in classrooms and youth clubs, his name was given to schools and streets, his death marked with solemn ceremonies. Only after the wall fell did the truth emerge from classified files, that the fatal bullets had come from his own side's Kalashnikovs, in a confusion created by a regime more interested in protecting its image than its soldiers. To understand how a 21-year-old from a small town became a symbol in a propaganda war he never chose, you have to go back to where he came from and what the world looked like when he put on his uniform. Egon Schultz was born on January 4, 1943, in Groß-Kiessau, in Pomerania, in the last years of the Second World War. He grew up as Germany was carved into occupation zones, then hardened into two rival states, the Federal Republic in the west, under American protection, and the German Democratic Republic in the east, under Soviet control. In the GDR, his childhood and adolescence were framed by the new ideology. He joined the state youth organizations, went through schools where textbooks hammered home the message that socialism was the future and that enemies lurked just beyond the Western horizon. By the time he was old enough to serve, the Cold War had given Berlin a unique and deadly role. It was the city where the two systems touched. On August 13, 1961, while Schultz was still a teenager, barbed wire and armed men appeared overnight along the sector borders, sealing off West Berlin from the east. Over the next months and years, that makeshift barrier evolved into a full-fledged fortification. Concrete walls, anti-vehicle trenches, mines in some sectors, parallel fences, floodlights, and a cleared death strip patrolled day and night by border troops. East German leaders called it an anti-fascist protection barrier, claiming it was necessary to stop spies and saboteurs from the West. But everyone could see the direction of traffic. Before the wall went up, nearly 3 million people had fled East Germany by simply walking or driving into West Berlin. The wall was not about keeping invaders out, it was about keeping citizens in. Schultz joined the Grenztruppen, the East German border troops, and by 1964 he was serving as a sergeant in a unit responsible for the Inner Berlin sector, one of the tensest stretches of the divide. His job was to patrol, watch, investigate anything unusual near the border, and, if ordered, use force to stop escape attempts. The GDR's shoot-to-kill policy towards Republikflüchtlinge, people fleeing the Republic, meant that in certain situations a young conscript might be expected to fire on unarmed civilians. On the other side of the wall, in West Berlin, a very different kind of work was going on. A group of students and activists at the Free University, many of them in their early 20s like Schultz, were using their technical skills and their freedom to challenge the wall not from above, but from below. Led by a young engineering student named Wolfgang Fuchs and joined by people like Joachim Neumann, who wanted to rescue his girlfriend Christa Grühle from the east, and physics student Reinhard Furrer, who would one day fly on the space shuttle, the group rented the basement of an abandoned bakery at 97 Bernauer Strasse in West Berlin. From that cellar, starting in April 1964, they began to dig a tunnel under the death strip, aiming for the courtyard behind an apartment building at Strelitzer Strasse 55 in East Berlin. They had no heavy machinery. They used shovels, pickaxes, handsaws, wheelbarrows, and wooden beams, mostly at night so the noise would blend into normal city sounds. They studied soil conditions, calculated distances, and adjusted their course using compasses and simple surveying tools. In a sense, they were practicing the same kind of creative problem solving that, on a larger scale, American and Western engineers were using to build jetliners, computers, and spacecraft, except their project was illegal, and failure could mean prison or death. By October, the tunnel was complete, about 145 meters long, roughly 12 meters underground, about 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. On the eastern end, the diggers had broken through into a disused outside lavatory, a small, shabby brick outbuilding in the courtyard of Strelitzer Strasse 55 in East Berlin. Under its concrete floor, now a hatch opened into a shaft leading down into darkness. Couriers in East Berlin, trusted go-betweens, quietly contacted around 120 people who wanted to escape, friends, relatives, and friends of friends. They told them, on the nights of October 3 and 4, come to Strelitzer Strasse 55, say the password Tokyo at the gate, chosen because the Tokyo Olympics were beginning that month, and you will be taken to a tunnel that leads under the wall to the west. On October 3, families arrived in small groups. They walked past border guards as if going to a party, went through the door, whispered Tokyo to an escape helper, and were led in their socks through the building and into the courtyard. There, they climbed down into the outhouse shaft, crawled through the narrow tunnel, and were hauled up into the bakery basement in West Berlin. By dawn, 29 people had escaped. The next night, the operation continued. More fugitives arrived at Strelitzer Strasse 55 and were processed the same way. Among the escape helpers on the eastern side were Christian Zobel and Reinhard Führer, standing in that courtyard, guiding people toward the entrance and keeping watch for trouble. Unbeknownst to them, the Stasi had already infiltrated their network. At least one prospective escapee had been an informant, reporting the plan to East German state security. The Stasi wanted to catch the helpers in the act, and perhaps gather more intelligence on Western support, so they set a counter-operation into motion. 2 Stasi officers in plain clothes went into the entrance of Strelitzer Strasse 55 and encountered 2 men they believed to be escape helpers. They claimed to be would-be escapees whose friend had just been released from custody and needed to be fetched, playing the part of nervous East Berliners eager to flee. The helpers, trusting the story, let them go. The Stasi men stepped back out, walked away, and went to summon a squad of uniformed border guards. One of the guards ordered to respond was Sergeant Egon Schultz. According to records later released, he was on duty at a nearby watch post when his unit was told to investigate suspected illegal activity at Strelitzer Strasse 55. No one told him there was a tunnel entrance in the courtyard. No one told him there were armed escape helpers inside. He was given a mission that sounded like routine border work. Go in, check, secure. Shortly after midnight, around 12:30 a.m. on October 5, Schultz and several comrades entered the building, weapons ready. They made their way through the hallway and stepped into the inner courtyard, the same yard where, hours earlier, families had shuffled through in stocking feet toward the outhouse and the shaft below. In that moment, 2 groups of young men faced each other in the dark. On one side, border troops with machine pistols, trained to see any escape attempt as an attack on the state. On the other, student escape helpers, armed with a single handgun, dedicated to getting people out of that state. The accounts of the next few seconds come from later testimonies and internal reports. They agree on the broad strokes. As Schultz moved into the courtyard, he took the lead, stepping ahead of a comrade named Volker M. with his weapon at the ready. Christian Zobel, realizing that the border troops had arrived and that the operation was blown, drew his pistol, intending to cover his retreat and that of others. Zobel fired. One bullet hit Egon Schultz, piercing his upper body, variously identified as his lung or shoulder in different documents. He fell or staggered, seriously wounded, but not necessarily beyond saving. At that point, another border guard, standing behind Schultz, opened up with his Kalashnikov, sending automatic bursts into the courtyard. Those bursts struck Schultz as well, causing catastrophic internal injuries. The friendly fire rounds, not the initial pistol shot, became the fatal blows. Chronik der Mauer, the Chronicle of the Wall, which drew on East German military and Stasi files after reunification, summarized the chain clearly. Zobel shot went through Schultz's lung, but the fatal bullets were fired by a Kalashnikov by a GDR border soldier. The internal NVA report reached the same conclusion. The East German leadership immediately classified these findings as secret. Schultz collapsed on the courtyard ground of Strelitzer Strasse 55. He was evacuated to the People's Police Hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He died shortly thereafter, becoming one of the recorded fatalities of the Berlin Wall. He was 21 years old. Within hours, the political machinery of the GDR began to spin his death into something it could use. State media announced that Sergeant Egon Schultz had been treacherously murdered by West Berlin agents during an attack on the border. The language was calculated. The escape helpers were described not as students or human smugglers, but as terrorists working for an agent organization from West Berlin, backed by imperialist forces. No mention was made of the friendly fire bursts fired by Schultz's comrade. No mention was made of the Stasi decoy tactics that had lured Schultz into the courtyard in the first place. The story was simplified into a clear picture: good socialist border defender, evil Western gunman. Over the next 25 years, that picture would be painted everywhere. Schools, kindergartens, and youth clubs were named after him. Plaques and reliefs bearing his face went up on buildings. His story entered school books and youth ceremonies as an example of sacrifice and the class struggle. GDR children attended Egon Schultz schools, recited oaths at Egon Schultz youth brigades, and marched past Egon Schultz memorials. In that carefully curated narrative, Schultz's last moments were not about confusion, friendly fire, and a dangerous policy. They were about a clear clash between socialism and Western sabotage. His image helped justify shoot-to-kill orders and the existence of the wall. If West Berlin bandits were trying to tunnel under the border and murdering border guards, then strong measures, so the argument went, were necessary. On the Western side, the initial reaction was more ambivalent. It was known that a border guard had been killed during the confrontation at Strelitzer Strasse 55, and that an escape helper had fired a pistol. Newspapers debated whether it had been right or wrong to arm the helpers. Some critics worried that the tunnel operations were escalating the risk of bloodshed. But Western media were not controlled by a single party line, and as time passed, more details emerged. Journalists and historians started to piece together the sequence: the Stasi decoy visit, the arrival of border troops, the fact that Schultz had been hit by more than one kind of weapon. Still, with the border closed and key files locked away in East Berlin, the full picture remained blurry until the 1990s. When the wall fell in 1989 and the GDR collapsed, German prosecutors and historians finally gained access to the NVA and Stasi archives. On the surface, Schultz's story might seem like a footnote in the long Cold War, one border guard among many, one incident among thousands at the Berlin Wall. But if you look closely, it becomes a lens into how different the two sides handled technology, truth, and the value of individual lives. At the time Egon Schultz died in that courtyard, the United States and its allies were investing not in walls to hem in their own people, but in systems that expanded horizons. Satellites that relayed live broadcasts, computers that were shrinking from room-sized monsters to man-sized racks, jetliners that cut travel times across oceans, and rockets that would soon carry Americans to the moon. The Soviet Union chased those achievements and scored some of its own, Sputnik, Gagarin, but often with a secrecy and rigidity that mirrored the internal controls it imposed on its citizens. East Germany, as a Soviet client state, followed that pattern at home. Facing a crisis of legitimacy as millions left, it chose to pour concrete around the problem and shoot those who tried to step around it. When that policy created a tragedy, one of their own young soldiers killed in the confusion of a botched response to a tunnel, they responded not by reassessing the policy, but by building a myth around the dead man to keep the policy intact. On the other side, the people who dug Tunnel 57 were operating in a culture that, for all its strategic anxieties, allowed open debate, investigative journalism, and a willingness to revisit even painful episodes. The same environment that produced world-leading technology also produced the conditions in which a mixed group of students, engineers, and even a future astronaut could question authority, raise funds, and spend months on an underground project whose whole purpose was to outwit a wall. In American World War II stories, there is often a sense of technological awe. Radars, bombers, code-breaking machines, and carriers, overwhelming regimes that relied on fear and brute force. In the Cold War, the arsenal looked different. ICBMs, reconnaissance satellites, integrated circuits, but the underlying contrast remained. Egon Scholz's story, placed against that backdrop, underscores the human cost when a state bets on walls and lies instead of on openness and innovation. He was a child of his system, sent into a courtyard by superiors who withheld crucial information from him, with rules of engagement that prioritized blocking escapes over preserving life. He died in a crossfire triggered by a policy that said it was better to risk killing one of your own than to let people leave. His death was then repackaged as a story that kept that same policy in place. For the escape helpers, including those on the Western side, he was a tragic figure as well. Even as they insisted on their own motives, that they were trying to save people from an unfree system, they later acknowledged that the death of Scholz weighed on them and that they had been thrust into a situation where any move could turn deadly. From their perspective, too, the GDR's decision to turn a tragedy into a teaching tool, rather than into an occasion for reform, said everything about the difference between the two sides. When you tell this story to an American audience, you are not just recounting another episode in the long list of Berlin Wall escapes. You are inviting them to reflect on what kind of world produces young men who dig 145-meter tunnels in a free city basement and young men who are ordered to guard a wall at gunpoint, and what happens when those worlds collide in a dark courtyard. Egon Scholz's last moments did not take place on a battlefield between superpowers. They took place in a cramped urban yard under dim lights between people who all spoke the same language. His death and the lies told about it defined in miniature the human cost of dividing a city and of trying to hold that division together even as technology, communication, and human desire pushed relentlessly in the other direction.